Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful sunny day um, to hear our little talk about planning for data centers. I'm Andrew Fraser-Urquhart at KC. Joining me is Charles, or as we all call him, Charlie Merrett, who was called to the bar in 2016 and recorded as a leading junior in all of the planning directories. A thoroughly able and good man. Charlie, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone.
And we are going to take you through a little bit about the current planning status of data centers. Um, and I will, at this point, channel a bit of my inner Alan Partridge. Those of you who used to watch Alan Partridge used to remember, might remember he had a little thing on his show called Alan's Hot Topic, which was accompanied by a particularly naff jingle. Well, this data centers is undoubtedly a hot topic. Just as a further illustration of this, I went this spring to the usual jamboree at MIPIM down in Cannes. And it's a bit like a party conference, MIPIM, whereby all of the fun actually happens on the fringe and the main conference itself is pretty bland. But in order to be associated with MIPIM, you have to sign up for at least one person to have an actual ticket to go inside, and that was given to me this year. And I went to a variety of fairly dull and uninteresting things, promoting the various merits of investing in various provincial West German towns and so forth. But the one event which was really deeply oversubscribed, standing room only, was a discussion about data centers, from which it was very apparent that it's a very big international business, and that the technology is proceeding apace. And a lot of the assumptions upon which we've thus far operated in terms of effects and needs and consequences may be becoming a little outdated, and we will deal with some of those later on in this discussion. So Charlie's going to operate the slides for us. We've got a question function enabled on this Zoom call. So if you want to ask a question, just bung it into the question part of the website and we'll come back to it at the appropriate stage. So if we can now just look at the introduction, that's us, that's our ugly mugs. What we're going to talk about is as follows. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the sector and the topic. Charlie's then going to take us through current and emerging planning policies. I'm going to look at some of the key issues and effects for planning decisions, a review of some of the more important decisions, some of the concepts which planners need to wrestle with. Charlie is then going to take us through the consequences of the decision to make NSIPs, sorry, to make data centers eligible to be considered in certain circumstances within the NSIP regime of the Planning Act 2008, the completely different regime. And then I'll just give some final thoughts at the end, and we'll deal with your questions. So just looking at the market, and one of our aims in this talk is to try and get through the technical and more general economic issues and to really barrel down into the planning consequences of those. That's kind of what we're here to do, and it's quite a difficult exercise in some ways with data centers. But just to give a flavor of it, they currently contribute, according to the most recent research that we could find, 4.7 billion pounds of value added to the UK economy, and that's thought to increase perhaps to somewhere north of 40 billion additionally up to 2035 from both construction and operation, and that will lead to a tax revenue of somewhere just north of 9 billion. So really quite a considerable contributor to the UK economy. And it's had a pattern of development whereby what we're seeing now is whereas development was predominantly focused in the southeast, clumped around London, and we'll look at some of that in detail in a minute or two, out to the north and to Wales. So that's where the sort of market goes. There's about 450 data centers, we think. Next slide, please, Charlie. Um, uh, in the UK, with a total capacity of around 1.6 gigawatts. Now, it's important just to pause here by way of a bit of definition. The gigawatts figure, which is obviously a measure of electrical capacity, is actually the figure of data processing capacity, rather than the electrical needs of these facilities. As we'll come to see later, that's quite a big issue, and the figure for data processing capacity does not equate to the amount of power needed. The amount of power needed is considerably more, by a factor of about 1.75, in terms of the processing capacity. So the total processing capacity of around 1.6 gigawatts, that's expected to rise in the relatively near future to somewhere between 3 and 6, obviously dependent in part upon what we do. And as I've said, the new hubs are emerging in Manchester, South Wales, and the northeast of England. And there are all sorts of issues raised about jobs, construction, supply chains, and sustainability. We'll come on to look at all of those later. But I just really, in this slide, direct your attention to a couple of useful sources of information. There's a government research paper from August 2025 to which we give you reference. And in particular, I would commend to you, as an introduction, those of you who want one, a House of Commons research paper of the 3rd of November of last year, which I found to be a very useful introduction to the topic. It's written for the education of members of Parliament, so I think most of us, the rest of us, will be able to understand it too. And it's a very good way of getting into the topic, so I'd recommend that to you. So that's the kind of scale of the market, the importance of it to a modern digital economy. Just a few pieces of terminology before we dive into it in detail. There are different types of data center. And it's very important, as we will see when assessing planning issues, to understand exactly what you're dealing with, and from a developer's perspective, to present it very clearly, from a local planning authority's perspective, to understand it very clearly. Now, data centers initially grew really from what most businesses of any size will have, which is a data room, a computer room, as back in the days one used to call it. And of course, that has expanded as we now no longer necessarily store data physically on our own devices, but it's stored through the cloud. Now, that was the original, really, starting point of data centers. Of course, they've expanded hugely. And you have mega cloud storage areas, which is provided by the big boys such as Microsoft and Amazon Web Services and so forth. And these are the really large facilities which have loomed in planning recently. However, there's another different type, which is known as edge centers. And those are for the provision of very local services where there's a need for almost instantaneous data transfer. One of the most commonly noted examples, which will come to this country in due course, no doubt, is with respect to autonomous vehicles, where the data processing needed by them has to occur very quickly, and as a result, tends to lead to smaller centres, which are located all over the place, very close to the area where their data is being used. And then, of course, the new kid on the block, increasingly going to take over our lives, one suspects, perhaps even one fears, is AI, and the enormous data processing needs of AI algorithms, not just for smaller uses, as I've talked about, for edge centers, but in more general types of AI for running businesses and whisper it for doing things that lawyers do. All these types of uses require, again, very large, very power hungry centers. And each of these different types of data center have their own locational requirements, which has quite a bearing on the planning process, as we'll see. Um, a couple of other terms of art, which perhaps useful for um, those who aren't immediately familiar with all the ins and outs of this area to know. Um, there's a concept called latency, which just really means the speed with which data is transferred. And that is important again in terms of locational restrictions. And there are also things called availability zones. Now, this is a market concept rather than a planning policy concept. But as we'll see, it has quite a role in planning decisions. And this is simply the concept that for reasons of what in the old days one would call economies of scale, but also matters of resiliency and shared technology and shared facilities, there is an area around data centers where they tend to congregate. In this country, that's presumably or mostly been in the southeast of England around London, and most particularly, in fact, around the northwest quadrant of London and that arc of the M25 that runs from sort of Sloughish up to Hemel Hempstead, that kind of arc, where there is a particular gathering of data centers thus far. And I say thus far because one of the market trends is that that area has started to perhaps become saturated. And as we will see later, there is a move away from those areas for at least some data centers. But you will hear that concept of availability zones discussed in various of the cases which I'm going to talk about in due course. So that is an introduction really to the market and some of the basic concepts. As I say, we now tack hard into the planning aspects of developing data centers. And I'm going to hand over to Charlie, who's going to take us through policy as it stands and as it is emerging.
Brilliant. Sorry, just getting my notes up, but thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I mean, I think sort of before delving into the policy current and emerging, as I'm sure many of you will be aware and have been keeping an eye on, it was by this time that we were expecting various publications from the government, including the draft NPS on data centres. That is yet to be published. And what we are left with at the moment is a real smorgasbord of governmental policy on data centres, both current and emerging, which a lot of which is not really planning policy. In parts, it's planning adjacent. Much of it may well directly or indirectly affect both planning applications and sort of applications for DCOs. But there is a somewhat a surprisingly sparse policy background given the centrality of data centers to a lot of what we do at the moment. So on this slide, the first current policy that we've got, and I think really it was the first step the government took in the sort of the evolving and the rapidly developing policy landscape, was designating data centers as critical national infrastructure, and that happened towards the end of 2024. And what this effectively does, and there's a written ministerial statement at the time announcing this, is to put our digital foundations in the same category as energy and water. Now, to be clear, this is not, at least as far as I can work out, a planning designation. It's effectively a national security one. And that means that data centers now get the same type of protection as energy and water under the National Protective Security Agency, whereby the government is effectively saying that damage or compromise of data centers would somehow significantly impact on this country in one way or another. It's therefore less clear to what extent this might factor into planning application DCOs. I'm not aware of anywhere it does factor in. But there are ways in which you can imagine it might be relevant. So, for example, various security requirements or design issues relating to a data center. To what extent can the acceptability of a design turn upon the need to secure it by reference to its status as critical national infrastructure. Probably an issue some of you have dealt with and would be interested to discuss, but I think that's really as far as that can go in that context. The more obvious planning designation or planning policy that we currently have, at least, is the NPPF. And that followed the end of 2024 consultation. I think it was December when these changes were introduced. And what we currently have are just these two references in the NPPF to data centers. The first of which, 86C, provided in full there, talks about what planning policy should do. And it says planning policy should pay particular regard to facilitating development to meet the needs of et cetera, data centers. Now, whilst this is driven at planning policies and not policies and decisions, where I certainly think this is going to be playing a role in the immediate sense, will be for applications where there isn't a relevant policy. Because once you don't have a policy which pays particular regard to facilitating data centers, there is at least an argument that it's out of date. But generally speaking, regardless of whether you're running that out of date argument or fending it off, what you've got here is the clear thrust that data centers, they should be facilitated, that it is the government's desire to build them out. 87A is the more specific locational policy, and it is effectively saying policies and decisions should recognize and address the specific location and requirements of different sectors. That sort of follows on quite nicely from what Andrew was just talking about with the three different types of data centers and how each three have different specific locational requirements. So whether, for example, you've got your ones required for the Waymos, which we're starting to see around London now, those will need to be closer. And that may well justify putting a data center in a relatively central urban location where otherwise you really wouldn't want to put that sort of development in. The final element of the current policy landscape, and I'm slightly hesitant to call it policy because it's unclear whether this is policy, whether it's government aspiration, what it really is AI growth zones. And there's a 13th of November 2025 paper called Delivering AI Growth Zones. And so far, we have 5 announced AI growth zones. Each of them have been announced through a separate press release, rather helpfully. And again, and I think following on from what Andrew was saying, you are seeing them all over the country. So this isn't really just a focus on the southeast of England and that sort of northwest corridor out of London, but we have them in Scotland, Wales, the northeast of England, and Oxfordshire specifically singled out like that. The paper, the November 2025 paper, makes clear that it is the government's ambition to position the UK as a global leader in AI innovation and adoption. Again, this, an AI growth zone, is not strictly speaking, as far as I can see, a planning designation. However, what that paper does is it identifies a series of ways or sort of manners in which growth zones will amount to growth zones. So what it is that the government is going to do to promote data centers or AI development in those areas as opposed to elsewhere. And it's a pretty comprehensive package of measures. Some are to be delivered, some are being delivered. But taken in the round, it certainly seems to me that what they do is they do provide or create, I should say, an attractive landscape for data center development within the growth zones when compared to other areas. I've put the 5 sort of areas or topics of the growth zones there at the bottom sort of bullet point. Some are more relevant than others to people on today's seminar. Probably the first 3 are the ones that we in the planning world will be most concerned with. As to the first of accelerating grid connections, I'm sure many of you will know that grid connections can pose significant issues, more often than not for the deliverability or the delivery of projects, but they do pose issues. I'm certainly aware of issues of capacity hindering development, and perhaps more prominently, lengthy connection queues, which effectively stop projects having any use until they're at the top of the queue. There is also, in my experience, a growing trend of objectors focusing on connections as a way to stymie schemes. So I've seen this most commonly with solar and wind farms, both in terms of overground and underground cabling. But there is certainly, in my experience, a growing trend of that being a way by which people are seeking to prevent schemes and connections to that. So the government are preparing a suite of steps to address and, in their words, accelerate grid connections, including new connection mechanisms, plans to remove speculative demand from the pipeline. Interestingly, exploring the possibility of self-build for high voltage lines and substations, and what they've entitled, although I haven't seen much more information on yet, the Connections Accelerator Service. But headline point from this is clearly something the government are aware are an issue at the moment with projects, and are taking real steps to try and address. The second point on discounted energy costs, in effect, is to do with the fact that in certain areas there is excess energy produced at certain times, which cannot be harnessed by the grid. And so this is more focused on sort of Scotland, Cumbria, and the Northeast, where there are high levels of renewables. But in effect, certain so in AI growth zones, they will be able to benefit from discounted energy costs as a result of that excess energy, which seems like a sort of a fundamentally good idea. And then the third of these, the third and the last one I'm going to touch on, are reducing the planning barriers, which is probably, I think we all know, the elephant in the room, and that's not just for data centers, that's for development at large at the moment. Really the current messaging, as far as I can see pretty clearly, is it's not just a baby build, but it needs to be done quickly and to remove some of the barriers that have been sort of developed over the years. There are a large number of measures proposed in the AI Growth Zones November paper for how planning barriers will be reduced. And I'm afraid to say, as I sort of started off this slide talking about, that some of them we are still waiting for. So perhaps most notably, the headline point under this is to update the NPPF and introduce the NPS in the next 3 months, which is now passed. So effectively, watch this space, because at the moment we have a relatively scant NPPF on data centers and no NPS whatsoever. They also intend to invest in additional specialist AI data center planning capacity. So as I understand it, what that proposal is to create a centralized or national sort of AI specialist workforce who local authorities can call on to determine applications. I think that will largely apply to the 1990 Act rather than the 2008, and query at the moment how many 1990 Act we will be having going forwards. I suppose the smaller data centers we almost invariably will, subject to the NPS. But it's certainly a novel proposal to have that centralized expertise, but one which will, in theory, be of value to local authorities. And then there's further measures, for example, protecting land, unblocking planning decisions, further streamlining events at consenting, which I think may be reference to what's now passed in the 2025 Act. But generally speaking, what you see here is a real thrust to get them built, get them built in locations across the country, and to do it more quickly than is currently being done. As to the emerging policy, I'm afraid the theme is and remains there is more to come. We were anticipating a lot of that to be done and to be at least in the public eye by now. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's not, given the world at large. But what it does leave us in is the sort of the wait and see. So the NPPF consultation, we have had sight of, obviously, that closed early March, I think, from memory. And that did specifically address data centers and on-site energy generation together in Annex A of that consultation. Much of the language, the introductory language, is really the same as the 2025 Delivering AI Growth Zones paper, which focuses on sort of positioning the UK as a leader in the world in the AI sort of sector. Um, the focus in Annex A, for those of you who hasn't read it, is really to do with the differences in project promotion between the 1990 Act and 2008 Act. Um, Looking at the energy requirements of data centers and the flexibility afforded by both being able to opt out of the 2008 regime and also the flexibility by being able to co-locate energy generating stations with data centers. Um, and so that led to the question that we've got on the slide there, which effectively means you'll see that the focus there is about sufficient flexibility, energy generation, and co-located with data centers. So really what it is does more need to be done to afford to let these be brought forward quickly? And that really is the thrust. It's not trying to say, it's not prescriptive. It's not saying we want you to do one certain route. The way I read this consultation and the documents at large is rather what do we need to do to get them built and get them built as quickly as possible. Um, Local policy, big question mark. 86C of the current NPPF, to my mind, indicates that local plans should be considering policies which either expressly or are concerned expressly with data centers or include them as part of a broader policy. We have had an announcement from City Hall last month that the next London plan will incorporate a specific data center policy, which is particularly important. And I think the last stat I saw is maybe over 60 data centers or 60 units are planned in London, subject to the tension. And I think there's a growing tension from what I can see in City Hall between the desire to develop data centers with various climate goals about water and energy consumption. But the headline point is emerging plans probably do need to consider what policies are appropriate, if any, for data center provision. We know London's going to be doing it. Where else? I don't know. And then finally, the big one, and unfortunately, sort of the silent one for now, which is the NPS statement on data centers. Nothing announced still, which means, and I'll sort of come onto this on the next series of slides I'm talking about, we don't really have thresholds for data centers and whether they are projects of national significance or not. All we can say is watch this space. And at the moment, we'll really see data centers will be applied or considered under more general business and commercial policy rather than any specific statement for data centers in and of themselves. So from that brief policy background, it's going back to Andrew for some useful facts on the ground.
Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, now applying that policy framework, I'm going to look first of all at some Secretary of State appeal decisions um, to see what we can discern from those about the key aspects of decision making and some of the trends in decision making. And then I'm going to try and look at some of the generic points that will arise in applications for consideration. Now, the clutch of Secretary of State decisions I'm going to talk about, they all actually relate to this arc that I've talked about between Slough and around towards Hemel Hempstead, that northwest quadrant of outer London. And one of the significant features of that, of course, is that it's all surrounded, it's all in the metropolitan green belt. So there was a lot of green belt policy came into play in these cases. The first is a long-running saga at a place called Woodlands Park, which is in Iver, just outside Slough. Slough, as I mentioned before, actually has some 30 to 35, we think, data centers in it. I know we have people from Slough on the call, so they may know more. But it's one of the largest centres in the country for data centres. It's actually the place of my birth as well, and so what a great place it must be. Now, Woodlands Park, this is a decision from January of 2024. So, under the Conservative government, I'm not sure that actually necessarily makes any difference as it does in many things in planning, but not, I think, in this. It was at that time the largest cloud hyperscale. So, it was a cloud data center, but it was a very large one. It was in the green belt, and the applicant's case, therefore, obviously had to be based around very special circumstances, based primarily, first of all, on need, but also on the basis of a lack of alternative sites. Now, one gets the impression that this was perhaps dealt with slightly too light a touch on this particular occasion, because the Secretary of State, one of the central parts of the decision, was that because the search for alternatives had confined itself to this availability zone, which, as I mentioned, is a term of industry art rather than a planning policy term, and looking for sites outside the green belt in an appropriate availability zone. The Secretary of State, I think, took a rather dim view of the fact that the search had been that limited, and therefore didn't give a great deal of weight in the VSC case to a consideration of available sites, and therefore dismissed the appeal. And another decision which I have not marked on the slides because it's not terribly informative is a place called Court Lane, which is another northwest London site, again a greenbelt case. And in that case, a rather more straight application of VSE was allowed, where effectively the needs case carried all before it and permission was granted. That was an early 2024 decision. So one began to see, I think, the emergence of a policy and governmental support for the grant of permission. The next case, which I've considered in some detail because I think it's probably the most instructive of the Secretary of State's decisions, is at Abbots Langley, which again is another site just round the corner from the other sites up in towards Hemel Hempstead, again out in that metropolitan greenbelt. And here, the case that was presented by the developers on availability zones was much more readily developed and referenced directly to the Woodlands Park, the first Woodlands Park case, which I've discussed. There was a great deal more emphasis put on the need for the various technical aspects of the availability zone, why it was effectively imperative for reasons of what's called load balancing, which is effectively making sure that the input and output of power and data is approximated and is able to be balanced with other sites in the area. And therefore, the alternative site search was limited to an 8 kilometre radius around Hemel Hempstead. And because it had been properly justified, the Secretary of State was prepared to accept that as a sensible and rational basis for an alternative site search. And obviously, with it being greenbelt land, there was more of an emphasis on whether the facility could be provided on a location which wasn't greenbelt. And that site survey limit was accepted as reasonable. Again, need figures were provided in some detail, with the applicant's forecast being accepted, and we'll come a bit later to see just how tricky a matter need actually can be. And with the site search being limited, with the need and the demands from London being accepted as part of the evidence, that was regarded as sufficient for to justify grant of permission on the basis of very special circumstances. But the Secretary of State, in fact, went further and decided that the land in question should properly be regarded as grey belt land. So this is the first sort of use really of the grey belt land concept in the data center world at least. And of course, that has the effect that with the Secretary of State having decided that this was grey belt, that there didn't need to be a VSC case because the development was not inappropriate, and the need case that had been deployed was such that the requirements in grey belt policy of meeting a demonstrable unmet need were said to be met, and therefore planning permission was granted. So the case is important, really, in showing, first of all, uh, yeah, thanks, Charlie. We can go to Woodlands Park 2, the next slide, I think, please. One more, one more. And another one. There we go. Right. Yeah, but say just finishing up on Abbots Langley, the importance of the grey belt policy, but also the importance of the locational requirements having been properly presented and understood by the inquiry, therefore allowing for a relatively limited alternative search to be factored into the decision. The next case, which is part of the ending, the ongoing saga rather of Woodlands Park. This is a second attempt, a second scheme by the same developers to get a permission for a data center on Woodlands Park. It was actually a bigger facility. Public inquiry, December last year, decision early part of this year. And the Secretary of State concluded that there would be significant harm in landscape and visual terms, but said that that impact would be localized. And this is really quite an interesting case because it shows, in a sense, the length that the Secretary of State at this point was prepared to go to grant planning permission, because the Secretary of State gave very considerable weight to the need for the data center. Again, permitted a relatively limited alternative site search zone to be regarded as acceptable, and in fact went beyond, considerably beyond what the inspector had recommended. The inspector considered the case in terms of Greenbelt and concluded that there were VSC. And the Secretary of State, of her own volition, actually said, no, no, this is not Greenbelt land at all. I'm regarding this as grey belt. And so therefore the VSC case didn't need to be made out. Now that was the Secretary of State's own decision, showing again how far support in policy and political terms was going for these schemes. But also another conclusion was that the Secretary of State, notwithstanding the pretty flagrant breaches of landscape and visual and other policies, and despite the fact there wasn't a specific data centres policy in the local plan, nevertheless concluded that the scheme was in accordance with the development plan as a whole. Now, to my mind, that's stretching the concept of considering the development plan as a whole quite a long way. And again, I think is indicative of the support given. Now, a footnote to this judgment is that, in fact, it has been quashed for reasons I don't quite understand. The developers sought to proceed without producing an environmental impact assessment. They got a screening opinion that said that they didn't need to do it. But unfortunately, the mitigation measures which had been proposed in order to get that screening opinion weren't properly legally secured, it seems. And therefore, when the decision was challenged by a couple of environmental groups, the Secretary of State had no alternative but to consent to judgment. So, after all of that policy support, what has to be regarded, I think, as a bit of a screw up, means that the planning permission has now been quashed, and they're back to square one, I suspect, in terms of presenting a case to the inspectorate. next slide, just to emphasize now that as well as these appeal decisions, there have been a number of local authority consents given in response to applications. And what's interesting to see is the geographical spread. I've mentioned some of the cases. Obviously, the Hertsmere one is smack bang in the northwest London quadrant, but Northumberland and North Lincolnshire showing the tendency to move, and these are both for large um, data centres. Um, Nearer away from London, nearer sources of, for example, renewable energy coming in from North Sea wind farms. So it's quite clear that local planning authorities are responding now to the desire for uh, permissions to be granted and giving permissions accordingly. Now, that's the sort of backdrop of where decisions have gone. Now, just a few words, if I may, on some of the factors that go into decisions. Charlie's taken us through the policy regime, the general support in the MPPF, but of course, that's expressed in terms of planning policies should ensure, and is less focused at this stage on development control decisions. What that may mean is that for local plans at the moment, most, I think, if not all, don't have specific data center policies, neither in terms of criteria-based policies or locational policies. Now, this is my one clever lawyer point of the afternoon. In those circumstances, one does wonder whether it might be possible for a developer to argue that there is no relevant development plan policy, given that the NPPF has specifically said that there now should be. And could a developer argue that on the basis of there being no relevant development plan policy, that paragraph 11 is in play and the tilted planning balance applies? I've not seen that argued yet, but I wonder whether it might be something which someone will have a go at. Another point to just mention is to remind ourselves that paragraph 5 of the MPPF says that national policy statements under the NSIP regime may be a material consideration, in the determination of Town and Country Planning Act applications. Now, as Charlie said, we await with bated breath for the MPPS to come forward, but one might anticipate a strong statement of support, strong indication of there being immediate need for such facilities as these, and therefore that may be something which developers can pray in aid in terms of developing a need case. Well, obviously depends on the wording of the MPS and the size of the facility being promoted, because obviously the closer it comes to whatever NSIP threshold there might be, the more likely it is that an inspector would regard the NPS as a material consideration. But what's said about need may well be of general application. We will see. Some of the other things, their need and locational requirements. These obviously need is really the vital factor in overcoming what can be pretty significant environmental effects. They're not terribly popular either, these data centers, because they produce relatively few jobs. The economic benefits for a local area may be less discernible than the wider societal benefits that provision of these facilities provide. And as we've seen, the policies are often quite generic, and therefore more difficult to respond to, perhaps, than would be a specific locational or criteria-based policy. As I've said, we may get some assistance in need cases with the MPS, but for the moment, they are very much business specific, in the sense that it is for the individual applicants to develop very carefully, in the absence really of all that much hard data and certainly no hard policy on what the need actually is. And therefore, it's a very important part of the preparation of any planning case to get that need case really clearly enumerated, because that is ultimately the trump card that developers have in seeking to get permission for what are otherwise quite environmentally difficult schemes, perhaps. And again, very important to focus, as I've mentioned earlier on the particular locational requirements for the different types of data center. Obviously, the needs of a an edge center, which is sort of providing guidance for autonomous vehicles in one particular town, obviously radically different from a regional or even national center provided by one of the big boys for cloud storage, and again for AI development. Again, the very large centers needed for AI algorithms. Of course, they are the one type of data center which benefits from a particular specific regime with the AI growth zones that Charlie's described. And then, of course, the other factor is green belt and grey belt policy. I've shown through some of the Secretary of State decisions how that's been quite a factor in that uh, quadrant in northwest London. As schemes diffuse across the country, it may be less so, obviously, albeit that there are plenty of green belts in other parts of the country. That one should certainly be aware of the fact that grey belt policies have been used in a number of these cases. And I think one can say more generally from other planning cases that it's proving, I think, surprisingly easy to get land designated as grey belt. The death by a thousand cuts argument, which is always applied in opposition to green belt schemes, may perhaps having less salience. Certainly, that's my experience in grey belt cases, with inspectors being more more willing to decide that land is in fact not strictly necessary for green belt purposes. Obviously, paraphrasing the test slightly, but that's the essence of it, and that's providing a reasonable outlet, I think, for development within the designated areas of the green belt. Um, and then looking further ahead at environmental effects, as I've said, some of these mean these schemes aren't unduly popular. Landscape and visual impact, these are large, fairly utilitarian buildings. And obviously, whilst careful design can mitigate it, nevertheless, there are real considerable impacts which need to be considered. Biodiversity net gain is always there now in these types of schemes, and we know it's going to be progressively applied to the NSIP regime as well, as data centers fall within that. And there's all the normal planning considerations, and important to remember that whatever the policy backing for the concept of data centers, these have got to be properly handled. So transport, footpaths, all the normal. And then the role of job creation. It's one of the features of data centers that they are very much enablers. The number of jobs that each facility provides can be relatively low. It may even be just a handful for some. For others, it's in the tens or the hundreds only. They're not enormous direct generators of employment, which again is one of the reasons that they don't necessarily commend themselves to local planning authorities. But again, in presenting a case, it's extremely important, I think, to get clear the much wider economic and societal benefits that they bring. Um, and then, of course, we come to in a sense, the real biggies of effect, which are those of sustainability. These things are enormous consumers of power. Um, as I said, there's a factor of about 1.75 in terms of IT processing compared to electricity needed to run the facilities. And I've seen estimates. I think the House of Commons research paper notes that if the expansion of data centers, which is envisaged up to 2030, actually takes place, these centers of themselves, by themselves, are going to be consuming about 10% of the entire national electricity generation. And that's a hell of a whack, frankly. And it's one of those issues which at some point I suspect is going to loom really large in an individual planning decision. At the moment, it's sort of just taken as a background factor, I think. But at some point, cases are going to be developed on the basis that saying that this thing should not be permitted because of the power issues and, of course, the associated issue of grid connection. Again, Charlie's talked about the AI zones and the desire to try and work on grid connections for those specific facilities. Again, that's only one subset of data centers, and this issue of grid connection is going to have to be clearly dealt with in applications, or else it might start to see applications failing on the grounds of sustainability and viability. And the other major point is water. Now, this is a slightly tricky issue. These schemes are perceived to require a large amount of water for cooling purposes, and again with all the knock-on effects on availability and so forth. Um, this is an area where, interestingly, I mentioned going to the talk at MIPIM about this. This is one thing that the developers across Europe were really keen to emphasize, is that they're moving more and more towards sort of closed water systems where they're not drawing from the local water resources, but instead have a sort of closed loop system for water circulation for cooling, which may mean that this issue loses some of its saliency. But again, it's another contributing factor, certainly the perception that they are enormous guzzlers of water, which makes them uh, not particularly popular schemes, and which therefore gives local authorities occasion to refuse schemes. And all of this really sums up, I think, is that in preparing and presenting cases, not just at the appeal stage, but also at the application stage, it's really important for developers to take the time and effort to explain in detail exactly how these things work, how the connection and locational issues work, how the sustainability issues work. Um, because these schemes are complicated technically, and they're not necessarily widely understood. And when you're presenting to local decision makers, the clearer these things can be, the better the exposition of the benefits can be in particular, the more likely it is that you'll get permission from the local planning authority. And so I'd say that's probably the leitmotif for the whole of these technical issues is clarity of understanding and presentation to try and get the best result. And then the final issue just in this little section, um, and I've got my eye on the clock, is the issue of net zero. And there is, and this is a Guardian article, and who knows, how accurate it is. One never knows with these things. But it's suggesting that, and it's not just the Guardian. There have been articles in the FT, I think, referenced in the House of Commons paper, suggesting that there is something of a tension in government between economic development and the concern that the net zero department has about the power and water needs of these schemes, and that there may be something of a tension in bringing into the economy on a very large scale these extremely power hungry schemes. And so one sees through this article, I set out the gist of it on the slide, the degree of tension that might be coming. And so we will just have to watch this space and see how that develops. So, at the moment, a strong policy push in support, but that might possibly change. Who knows? Right. That's the sort of some of the nuts and bolts of the planning issues. The last part of this matrix really is the inclusion of data centers as NSIPs, which Charlie is going to tell us about.
Yeah, and I've just clocked this slide is a little bit more condensed than the last ones, but hopefully you can all read it. There isn't too much information on here, and I think picking up where I left off, I'm afraid, it's sort of still wait and see. Um, we have had that big change January this year of the inclusion of data centers within or being possible or capable of being an NSIP. The way that the amendment worked, getting a bit legalistic or lawyery for a second, was simply to include data centers as a term. It's not a defined term. And so really, I'm afraid, like many of these things, it's going to be a matter of judgment. What is a data center and how is it distinct from something else? Something that I often sort of struggle with when it comes to data centers is the extent to which it isn't just a large warehouse in planning terms. Yes, there are significant or potentially significant energy demands, but in terms of design, impact, size, location, things like that. We are talking about a large warehouse, effectively deep storage with computers in. Uh, so there are going to have to be judgments made about, well, does a project qualify as a data center? Is it actually a data center? For those of you familiar with the DCO regime and specifically Section 35 and the ability to opt in, that is, to be fair, one of the three judgments that must be made if you do apply to opt in. So the three elements that must be met to be able to opt into the 2008 regime are, firstly, that it is a business or commercial project of a prescribed description. So for those of you who are considering putting forward a data center under the 2008 Act rather than 1991, you will have to make the case why it is a data center and why it's a data center rather than something else. Perhaps, I don't know. My suspicion is there isn't going to be a huge appetite to be highly difficult about this point, given the general thrust to get them through. I was sort of very interested in hearing what Andrew was saying about how, some of those decisions he was going through, there was just such a push to get it through by the Secretary of State that they were finding sort of compliance with the plan, notwithstanding no policies on the point. That's the thrust. Probably not going to be too difficult over whether something is a data center on the fine points, but just a point bearing in mind. B is really only relevant because I appreciate and I apologize for not addressing it earlier in the talk, and that we've got someone or people from Wales on the talk here. You've got the 2024 Act, I think it is, in Wales. I think we'll come to questions at the end, but just to answer that question, because I'm on the topic now, I'm not aware of any sort of documents that have been announced or certainly not published on data centers in Wales. There is, I think, guidance on the 2024 Act, but I don't think that's bespoke to data centers. And then the third point, and this is sort of the headline one, especially given a sort of last month's decision in Buckinghamshire, that the project will be of national significance. Now, until we've got the NPS, what we really have is a 2013 policy statement by the government on business and commercial projects. And until we get a specific NPS, what we don't have is any guidance on thresholds, and we don't even know how those thresholds will be judged. Will it be floor space, capacity, energy use? I don't think I don't know. I never quite understand what this sort of the word in the moment is, but compute. Will it be to do with compute? We don't know, and we will see. So for now, rather than having those specific and sort of maybe bespoke thresholds for what would make a data center potentially qualify as a project, we instead have the more general ones in the 2013 statement. Now those are in the 2013 policy statement. There are effectively 4 bullet points which have to be considered if you're asking doing the opt-in procedure for business or commercial projects. And those are whether a project's likely to have a significant economic impact or is important for driving growth in the economy, whether it's got an impact across an area wider than the local authority, whether it's of substantial physical size, and there's more information later in the document on that, and whether it's important to the delivery of a nationally significant infrastructure project or other significant development. You don't have to meet all 4 of those, but taking a step back here, for larger data centers, given the governmental thrust, given the approach in the appeal decisions, given the clear desire to make the UK an innovator and leader in the field of things like AI, it seems that you will often have a pretty strong argument that a data center of a large enough data center will be of national significance. Certainly taking that first point, it's important for driving growth in the economy. I mean, the government has effectively told us as much that is where they see the economy going, is one which is sort of not dependent upon, certainly dependent on, but data centers play a large role in that. So that argument is a relatively easy one to make out, in my view. And we have in fact seen that in practice, and that's the Wopseys Wood landfill site in Buckinghamshire, and that's the 16th of March 2026. And what that was is so the proposal there is for what's called a data center campus, and that's of up to 3 hyperscale data center buildings, and that includes server halls, cooling infrastructure, with a proposed IT load of up to circa 300 megawatts across the 3 buildings. That's 100 megawatts per building. Um, and in the 21st of January of this year, the application was made to treat it as national significance. And the direction was given last month, on the 16th of March, that it was under Section 35. In determining that the Wopseys Wood data centre was or is of national significance, 4 reasons were given, and they relatively closely mirror the reasoning in the 2013 document for business and commercial projects at large. First, the proposal would be likely to have a significant economic impact. Second, and it was still that the second half of that first line, the proposal would be important in driving growth in the economy. Third, it would have an impact on an area wider than a single local authority area. And fourth, the proposed projects related to a proposed energy centre project for which development consent is required and would benefit from being considered as a single application. So that's the sort of effectively the flexibility of having co-locational projects. But and whilst I think it likely from that you will often have these issues of co-locational issues whereby data centres are being brought into consideration of the energy generation more generally, whether it's the 50 or 100 megawatt thresholds. The point is that yes, that's a big scheme, up to 300 megawatts, but nevertheless, aside from the size, it's just a big data center, and that's not surprising. I mean, that is how the DCO process works. If it's big enough, it can be a DCO. Just a point, just I thought an interesting and timely point, given until we go and get the NPS of any kind, this is going to be effectively, as I see the approach going forwards. And for those of you who are promoting or in some way involved with data center projects, I'm sure you'll be advised and you'll be familiar with there are benefits to the DCO process. There is the set timetable. There is the fact that all the consenting regime is swept up in one. And there are, and it is effectively this last point on the slide before going to conclusions and reflections. I don't know, I can see questions are popping up. I don't know how, I'm sure we can deal with some of them before people head off. The fact that the NSIP regime has tightened up. I'm not going to go through all of them. That's, I'm sure you're that's a separate talk. But the fundamental point is that changes have been brought about both throughout the NSIP process, most notably consultation, and then at the very end for any potential legal challenge to speed it up and get projects delivered. On that last point, what we now see, and it's I think a change which maybe is going to be more significant than some of us thought, was that they've gotten rid of the paper permission stage for a challenge to a DCO, and the other and perhaps more significant point is that if the High Court marks an application as totally without merit, that is the end of the road and there is no right of appeal. And we had the first example of that at the very end of last week about a solar project, which was Stone Street Green in Kent. But what we had there, that was a project of just below 100 megawatts. Decision letter was 22nd of October 2025. And then sort of last week, I think the 24th of April, Natalie Leven refused permission for judicial review. The grounds were sort of typical reasons and similar, but significantly for the purposes of the delivery of that scheme, she also marked it as totally without merit. So that means that that is the end of it. There is no more legal challenge. Between October 2025 decision letter, April 2026, totally without merit. That's it. no more going up and down the courts, no more waiting to deliver, and that is sort of exactly what the government were trying to achieve with these changes. And it sort of draws quite a stark contrast with, for example, the Sizewell C litigation, which I think was at least 2 years. So when you're thinking, do you go for the 1990 Act or 2008 Act for a data center in England at the very least? That is something to bear in mind, that if you can deal with or if you are interested in dealing with the DCO process, yes, there is more complexity up front, but you do get the benefits of the timetable, the holistic consenting regimes, and also, as we've now seen last week, uh, a way for court cases to end much more quickly than they previously would have. That is the end of that slide. So reflections, conclusions, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. And before I just provide some very brief thoughts at the end. Um, as I see people are dropping off, and despite worrying whether we would fill an hour, we've more than filled it and overrun, as we always do. Just deal with a couple of the questions that have been raised. One has pointed out, and helpfully, actually, I strongly encourage this. A number of questions, because it's done on the open forum, have been answered by other participants in the presentation, which is great and saves us a job. So thank you. The one of the questions that's been raised, it's noted that data centers are regarded for use class purposes as within B8, and the suggestion is made, well, why don't you just find a suitable warehouse and away you go? I mean, theoretically, that's possible, of course, but it has to be remembered that B8 only deals with change of use, and of course is relatively strictly confined. And given that data centers often have all sorts of other additional infrastructure, which requires not only operational development, but also sometimes descriptions of development which go outside the simple use class definition. It's actually much less common than you might think, given that simple proposition. And most development proposals tend to promote it as a sui generis rather than a B8. Another question notes that because of the need for backup power and so forth, often large data center projects come with their own power plants, which may of themselves exceed the NSIP threshold. So therefore, why doesn't the whole thing become an NSIP? And I think the answer to that is one looks always, for the purpose of classifying the route for decision making, at the overall description of development, and where the description of development focuses as a data center, and these other matters are purely backups, effectively ancillary or part of a mixed use with the data center. I think the view's been taken that they fall within that description, and therefore within the Town and Country Planning Act. Now, obviously, we're seeing the evolution of the NSIP regime for these schemes, and all that may change. And then the last the last couple of points I wanted to pick up on. Somebody asked whether or not the heat that was generated by these large facilities might be used through means of heat exchange to heat other buildings and so forth. And the answer is yes, that is an emerging trend. There have been a couple of examples noted in the responses to questions online. Also, I know the Elsham Woods scheme in North Lincolnshire, which was recently consented by the local planning authority, that powered quite a large number of greenhouses, that being large part of the local economy up there in North Lincolnshire. And so a number of glass houses are being heated by the heat generated by the schemes. And then finally, I think a question was asking about the special planning zone, which I think is pointed to as part of the reason for Slough's attractiveness. I think there are lots of other geographical reasons, actually, with Slough being part of the M4 corridor, and hooked up to that quadrant of development that I've mentioned. But I think it's a question that the SPZs, can't decide whether I'm British or American, um, are a local initiative, and at least initially. And therefore, I think the fact that although there's a strong policy support for data centers, they're not necessarily the sexiest and most popular things, and that may explain a reticence of other local authorities to go down that route. Um, So that I think I hope deals with the questions. And Charlie has any thoughts, he'll come in due course. Um, They were just really my final reflections before we wrap up. Clearly, it's an area where there's strong policy support, and I think that's probably the dominant feature thus far of developments in this area. But what we're seeing is the evolving technical and locational requirements and the need for a really clear understanding of the particular technical and locational requirements for the type of data center that's being promoted. And that's to offset against the significant environmental impacts. And we may find that the power demands in particular, and it may be that water will sort of fade away, but certainly the power demands and the other significant environmental effects may lead to a degree of resistance. And it'll be interesting to see whether that, particularly as the grid connection and power issues really begin to bite, whether or not that will in fact lead to successful resistance of these schemes, or whether the currently strong policy support will continue to, as it were, overwhelm those problems when the planning balance is drawn. We'll have to see the attractiveness of the NSIP regime, whether people really want to use it. Obviously, it has the advantage that it takes the decision making out of the hands of a local planning authority in the first instance and straight to the Secretary of State, where one might expect sort of central concerns about the desire to have these schemes come to the fore. Certainly, that's one of the attractivenesses of the NSIP regime, and all in all, we'll have to see whether this really is the unstoppable force that at the moment it sort of seems to be in policy terms. Charlie, do you have any final thoughts before we say goodbye to everybody?
No, I think it would. I think that was an extremely accurate and pertinent summary, and it'd be remiss of me to ruin it with anything unnecessary beyond that. So just beyond saying thank you to everyone for attending today.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to you, Charlie, and thanks for all who've attended. I hope it's been useful. Certainly, we found it very enjoyable researching, presenting, and understanding this issue. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.